Washington Journal continues.
We welcome back Melanie Sloan. She is the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, otherwise known as CREW. Good morning. Thanks for being with us. I want to read just the first sentence of your executive summary, which really gets to the essence of what we want to focus on. Heading a committee in the House of Representatives brings rewards beyond the chance to write important bills, an increase in campaign contributions from the same industries that those committees are supposed to oversee. First of all, what did you find, and is there anything wrong with this?
Well, we found that committee membership jacks up your contributions considerably. The higher you go on a committee, the higher you range in leadership, the more money you'll get. And the percentages are really quite surprising. So you get so much more money from the industry you regulate than from your contributions overall.
Well, let's look at a couple of examples. First of all, the chair of the House Committee on Armed Services, Buck McKeon, Republican of California, we can show this as well, that in the 1998 election cycle, he brought in about $40,000 from industry contributions, and in total about $500,000. In the 2010 election cycle, as he was about to become chair of the committee, he brought in more than $460,000 in industry contributions and a total of about $2 million for his campaign.
Right, which means that his industry contributions increased by over 1,000%. While his overall contributions increased by approximately 300%. So that's the kind of thing we're seeing, that the contributions are so much more dramatic from the industries these members regulate than from their contributions overall, with very few exceptions.
Another example, Congressman Fred Upton, he's a Republican from Michigan, the chair of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. In 1998, he brought in industry-wide about $200,000. In 2010, $1.2 million.
Yep. Again, it's a huge difference. It's a 548% increase from industry and a 277% increase in contributions overall. Now, you do see some people for whom that doesn't hold true. Similarly, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Democrat Henry Waxman, his contributions have remained about constant. They went up 1,055% by the industry and 1,100% overall. So that's one of the outliers, though. And there was actually one member of Congress whose contributions have really gone down, and that is Ralph Hall on the Space and Science Committee. He took an 11% drop in industry contributions and a 47% drop in contributions overall. You have to wonder if Mr. Hall is considering retiring given that plummet.
And to be fair about this, let's look at some of the ranking Democratic members, including Congressman Colin Peterson. He's a Democrat from Minnesota. He is the ranking Democrat on the House Committee on Agriculture. In 1998, from the industry, he brought in about $80,000. In 2010, as the ranking Democrat, $650,000. These are rough estimates.
Right. This is not a party issue. This is something that is consistent on both parties. It is simply a matter of becoming higher and higher in the leadership is what really influences your contributions. And of course, when you're in the majority, your contributions are higher than when you're in the minority. But that has held true depending on which party's in power. It doesn't matter.
Our guest is Melanie Sloan of CREW. You can get more information online at citizensforethics.org. You can give us a call. 202 is the area code, 737-0001, our line for Democrats, or 202-737-0002 for Republicans, or join the conversation online at twitter.com/cspanwj, or send us an email, journal@cspan.org. Second part of my question, is there anything wrong with this?
Well, I think the bigger problem is that there's something wrong with our entire system. Members of Congress are indebted to those who they need contributions from. They need a lot of money to be reelected each year, and they are most likely to get that money from those who have needs before them, who they're regulating. So I think there is something wrong with it. But I don't think in our system, it's not like it's a crime. It's just that it is a troubling part of our system that means that our members of Congress are more indebted to the special interests than they are to the public interest.
I want to put another figure on the table from the Center for Responsive Politics, looking at how much money members of Congress need to raise in the House of Representatives. And I use this figure with David Walker. If you're seeking re-election, on average, that member needs to raise about $10,000 a week. That puts them in a difficult situation if they're facing an opponent, either the primary or general election, who has a lot of money, or if they're self-funded.
Right. It's a very big problem. And of course, the bigger media market you're in, the more expensive your races. And things have only gotten worse now since the advent of the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court case that has allowed more money than ever to flow into politics, meaning that members of Congress are even more worried about the kind of ads that outside groups are going to be spending on them. So they need even more money to run their races. Another
figure I want to put on the table, according to your study, about 30%, exactly 27% to be specific, of the donations to the committee leaders received in 2010 came from the industries that they are responsible for overseeing.
Right. And there's another part of this study that we did which also shows that a lot of these members are voting, in fact, more favorably towards the industries they're regulating. Not every single time, but there are a significant number of them who vote more than other members of their party in favor of the industry who they're regulating.
But they may say that they're serving on these committees because they're passionate about a particular issue, and so the industries are obviously affected by decisions, but they're on a defense committee or agriculture committee or an interior committee because that's what brought them to Congress.
Sure, that's always possible, but it is certainly remarkable, I think, the number of members of Congress who seem to be voting with the industries that have helped keep them in Congress.
Melanie Sloan is our guest. Steve is joining us from Warren, Michigan, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, my question is, these politicians raise a lot of money, and I'd like to know what happens if they do not spend the money that they were given, and they decide to retire or quit politics. What happens to the excess money in their account? Do they pay taxes on it? Do they give it back?
Thank you, caller. We get that question just about every other day here.
And no, they don't give it back. What they do with that money is they generally keep it in a campaign account and then they dole it out over time to other candidates that they like. And often they can keep it for many, many years. In fact, some of these campaign accounts exist past the time members have died.
Next is Charlie from New York. Good morning, Republican line.
Good morning. I'm just wondering, I'm certainly concerned about the Citizens United passed by the Supreme Court, and I understand there's an amendment in Congress, possibly by Senator Sanders, among others, that would possibly change that decision of the Supreme Court. Is that the only way to get lobbyists out of politics? Because whether it's the Democrats or Republicans, it seems that the only way we can get back our country is if lobbyists, all of them, are eliminated in America.
Well, let me say it would be very hard to eliminate lobbyists. First, it is included in the Constitution of the United States that people have the right to lobby the government. They have that constitutional right. There's a protection for that. But that said, the real problem, in my view, isn't so much the lobbyists, it's the money that those lobbyists come with. It's the influence that the money that they bring with them from the industries that they're representing have so much influence on members of Congress. And I do think that that's a significant issue. The legislation you're talking about, there's something that was called the Disclose Act, which would have required more disclosure of the people who are behind the ads that we'll all be seeing on our televisions in the coming election cycle. Often those ads are put out by groups with anonymous but very patriotic sounding names, Americans for America kind of thing, and you don't know who's behind it. And there's legislation that would require that information to be disclosed, although I will say that the Republican Party has been adamantly opposed to that, so that really doesn't have any hope right now. Other than that, there is the talk of a constitutional amendment to change Citizens United, but I do think that's a long shot at this point.
Spencer Backus is a Republican from Alabama. He's the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, and according to your study, from 1998 through 2010, he had seen his contributions increase 620% in that short time period.
Right. And that's a pretty dramatic amount. And of course, there's been a lot of regulation going through the Financial Services Committee as we've been in this financial crisis. It is also true that Mr. Backus is one of the members in our study who we found voted more favorably with the industry more frequently than other members of his party. And I do think that's notable in this case because so many Republicans were critical of any legislation to following the financial crisis, and yet Mr. Backus voted even more than members of his party in favor of the interests of those he regulated.
And what about the former chair, now the ranking Democrat, Barney Frank of Massachusetts?
Interestingly, Mr. Frank also had a huge uptick in his contributions. He had over 2,600% increase between 1998 and 2010. As opposed to his overall increase in contributions of about 1,300%. And yet, interestingly, Mr. Frank, according to what we found, didn't vote more frequently than the average Democrat with the industry. Floyd
is joining us from Terra Alta, West Virginia, Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I think it just goes to show that this country's in bad shape. We got all the politicians walking in. Some of them walk in with very little money and walk out being millionaires. Then we find out that they're allowed to do inside training and everything else. You know, it is time for this country to get away from these people and re-elect good people. Get rid of all of them. Put new people in. We're not supposed to have professional politicians in this country, but that's what we ended up with. And I think it's time we look at everything, the money that's under the table, all of it, because we know we're not seeing it all. Thank you.
Floyd, thanks for the call and the comment. We'll go to Amin, joining us from Austin, Texas. Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. The previous caller stole a little of my thunder. It's against the law for insider trading anywhere else, but the politicians can find out stuff and then they can insider trade. I mean, it's ridiculous. How can they be able to do this when the rest of the public can't do this? Aren't they supposed to be representing us?
I will agree with you. It is ridiculous. And there was a very illuminating 60 Minutes report on this just a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was just last week, about this exact issue. And there has been legislation for quite some time called the Stock Act that would, in fact, stop members of Congress from trading on the kind of information they uncover while they're regulating industries. But not surprisingly, it has never had any movement in Congress. This legislation has been there for many years, and it has really gotten no traction. I think the story that has come out about that has led to people being more interested in it, and I believe that there are even hearings scheduled on it now. So perhaps we'll see some future gains in there. But I agree with the callers that this is a significant problem.
Todd Clay has this point. He says the country isn't in bad shape. The politicians are in bad shape, he writes. How do you reelect people that lie to you? Next is Joe, Republican line, Mayfield, New York. Good morning.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my call. I think the speaker you had on earlier who talked about term limits was, hitting on something that might help the situation, getting rid of the career politicians. I think we go a long way towards getting some of these abuses taken care of, and maybe somehow or other getting these kind of reforms put out as referendums for people to vote on would go a long way too, because I don't see the fox in the hen house, making the changes that need to be made to straighten this situation out. That's it.
Your response?
Well, I know there's a lot of talk about term limits, and people feel that might be a solution. My own view is that the real solution is campaign finance reform. David Walker talked about that a little bit before, your previous guest, and I really think that if we want our politicians to represent our interests and not the special interests, they can't be constantly dialing for dollars and trying to get more and more money for their reelection campaigns. They need to be indebted to us, the American people, for their jobs and not to special interests. And the only way to do that is to take the money out of politics.
Allie is joining us, Lebanon, Ohio, with Melanie Sloan of Crew, Independent Line. What's on your mind?
Good morning, Ms. Sloan. C-SPAN, the best reality programming on television. Ms. Sloan, in the spirit of transparency, what role does educating American citizens, voting citizens out there, play in raising awareness, and ability to appreciate what's going on? I mean, if we took the case of the super committee and brought that to prime time, if we showed that on television versus, let's say, the debates, would that not show really the action or inaction? And your constituency comes to you, your site, to learn more. But how about, do you all reach out to people out there to teach them more about what's going on?
Well, we certainly try to do our best to get the message out. It's why we put out reports like the one that we're talking about here today, and it's why I'm here on C-SPAN, so that we can tell a large number of viewers about the kind of problems we're seeing in Washington. And we're not alone in that. There are other good government groups like the Center for Responsive Politics and MapLight, both of whose data we relied on in part for the study, who are doing the same thing. So it is important to educate the American public so that people know exactly what's going on here, because I think that is a big part of the problem. People don't know what's going on in Washington, and in large part, it's Americans' fault. They'd rather watch Kim Kardashian than C-SPAN.
Well, Linda wants C-SPAN 4. She sent this tweet. Let me share it with you. She says, we need C-SPAN 4, a live feed of the security video at the check-in at the U.S. Capitol. Let's see who's coming in to visit with our representatives.
Yeah. That would be a little harder than you think, because there are many, many doors in both the House and Senate, and just having the video feed, they don't actually have to sign in like you do if you're going into the White House. So I think that would take a little more. But there has been an effort to have members of Congress put their calendars out in public. A group called the Sunlight Foundation has been advocating for that for a while. And so if members of Congress would list all their meetings with lobbyists, I think that'd be helpful to all of us.
It's called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Who funds CREW?
CREW is funded by regular members of the public and people who can contribute on our website. We also have some foundation donors, as well as wealthier Americans who share our view that politics got a lot of problems with the money in politics these days, and that honesty and integrity are values that we want to instill in our politician and our political system.
Back to your report, which, by the way, is available online if you want to check it out. It's also a link through cspan.org. With few exceptions, your study illustrates just how deeply the pay-to-play culture has penetrated the House of Representatives.
Yes, that's true. You know, in some respects, I think some reporters looked at our report and said, well, you know, we all know this. This is run-of-the-mill in Washington. We have a pay-to-play culture. But it's really when you see it down on paper and you see the percentages of the increase, I think that really makes more of a mark, and people can understand it more clearly.
Phil from Emporia, Kansas, Republican line with Melanie Sloan. Good morning. Phil, go ahead, please.
Good morning. How are you today?
Good morning.
I guess for me, I like the idea of reform, but I think what's getting neglected in this is, of course, as a member of the public, I'm part of actually more than one lobby. I'm a veteran, and I'm a senior, and I get inundated by the AARP just all the time. Of course, they have my interests in mind. And reform is a great idea, but I think until we ourselves actually reform, it's going to be difficult, because I know what I'm going to do, and maybe other callers won't be as honest as I am. But if it comes to an interest, I'm going to protect mine against yours.
Thanks for the call.
Well, I think that is a problem, and I think that sometimes we see that with members of Congress as well, that they're worried about more parochial interests than our interests as a nation as a whole.
Frank from, George from Gaffney, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi. I just want to make a quote that one of our presidents had quoted about our Congress, and if I could, just a scripture from Proverbs that goes with it. This is from James Garfield, 20th President of the United States. He quoted, "Now more than ever, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it is because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption." So therefore, that's why I think the Occupy Wall Street is all about. We're tired of it. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. We're not going to tolerate Congress, the Senate, or the House of Representatives, with the things that are going on.
I agree with the caller that this is a significant problem. We read earlier this week that Representative Charlie Rangel from New York, who was the first member of Congress to be censured in over 25 years at the end of last year, just had a big fundraiser. First, he was reelected to Congress despite the fact that he was censured. His constituents brought him back. And now all the top Democrats have been at a big fundraiser for him, including the minority leader, Nancy Pelosi. So it seems that we don't take ethics as seriously as we should in Congress.
Jim has this point on our Twitter page, and there are a lot of people weighing in on this topic today. When it is Congress that must write the legislation, how in the world will we reform anything at odds with members of Congress?
Well, it is, in fact, hard to reform this situation. Members of Congress do write legislation, and they often do need the assistance of lobbyists who are experts in their fields to help them with these issues. But members of Congress need to remember that the people they're there to represent are really us, the greater American public, and not the special interests. And I think that point has really been getting lost in Congress in the past years.
We're talking with Melanie Sloan of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Frank is on the phone, Greensburg, Pennsylvania, Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you guys doing today? The only point I wanted to make was that when we talk about Citizens United, that's a relatively new, and from my perspective, relatively new enactment that even the playing field. We've always had the George Soros's out there with the fronts. We've had the big unions pretty much bashing Republicans as far as the October surprise and all that comes from the unions. Basically the Democrats are in bed with the unions, and my concern is if you overturn Citizens United, we're back to the old days where it's one game in town.
Thanks for that.
That's the ability of the Democrats to do what the Republicans are hamstrung to not do.
Well, I don't think that's an entirely accurate depiction. In fact, what Citizens United did was say that both corporations and unions could use money from their corporate treasuries to fund ads deliberately advocating the defeat or election of a specific candidate. And before Citizens United, they couldn't do that. And so that applied equally to unions and corporations.
Our next call is Matt, Mount Vernon, New York, Republican Line. Good morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking a lot about the incentive, what incentivizes congressional members to keep doing what they're doing, and that is that they kind of have a cushy deal. But to be perfectly frank, what we're really lacking in is options in leadership. When you say, I mean, if people go to D.C. to become part of that sort of recidivist, like, comfortable culture of political donations and benefiting from it in various ways, and the Occupy Wall Street movement has a point in being fed up, but then when you ask them what they want to do, they have no answers.
Well, I think that's because the answers are so tough. I think so many Americans are fed up with Congress, and I think the total failure of the super committee will just further enrage people and make them more frustrated with Congress, and I think rightly so. Congress really can't seem to get anything done. And part of the problem really seems to be all of the special interests that each member of Congress feels the need to protect.
Your report that came out last week focusing on money and politics, there are two related emails that I want to share with our viewers. First, from India Jenkins of Miami, saying the Citizens United decision paved the way for more corrupted politicians to serve in our government with more special interests and less common sense. It's the Washington version of Gordon Gekko and Bernie Madoff put together. We need campaign finance reform now. And a separate email from Jim, who lives in Louisville, Kentucky, saying, Ms. Sloan, getting the money out of politics is a great idea. Please elaborate as to the best way to reform campaign financing.
Well, right now we have a very big problem, which is the Supreme Court's decision on Citizens United. The Supreme Court is currently equating money with speech, meaning that it's very hard to regulate it. So I think we are going to need some changes in the Supreme Court, and this Citizens United decision will have to be overturned. I think it will go down in history as one of the worst decisions in our nation's history, and I think it will not stand up over time. I think Americans of all political stripes are going to be increasingly frustrated with the kind of ads that we're all going to be seeing in this election cycle that are going to be filled with lies and have truths. We're not going to be able to turn on our TVs except to see these kind of ads. And I think that, and the other part of that is that we're not going to know who's behind those ads, whose interests really are behind them. Is it Exxon that's putting out an ad that's against a senator who's been worried about global warming? These are the kind of problems we'll be worried about. And I think that as Americans are more frustrated, there will be more call and more push for Congress to act.
We're talking about money in politics, and one of the findings from your report is this. It raises new questions about how beholden House committee chairmen and ranking members are to the industries that they oversee and whether or not they are independent enough to put public interest ahead of special interests. Tim is joining us from Minnesota, Independent Line with Melanie Sloan. Good morning.
Yeah, I don't believe the unions, or the corporations should be involved in our election process. No way, no how. And also, I saw some type of expose or piece, whatever you want to call it, the other night where these congressmen, they go to office and they come out richer than they went in because they have insider, non-public information on how to play their stocks, okay? There's something wrong with that. There's something really wrong with that. And then in the end, all you get is Democrats and Republicans pointing their fingers at each other. We're out here fighting because they can't do their job and they're busy making money in office.
More reaction to that Steve Croft piece.
Yes, that is indeed a significant problem. It is outrageous that members of Congress can come in and commit to serving the public and then come in here and use that position in order to make monies for themselves, their friends, and their families. And we saw that one great example in that piece was Speaker Dennis Hastert, former Speaker Dennis Hastert, who was involved in a land deal, that he got a very good deal on land, and his part in the scheme was to put in an earmark for a road, which then increased the value of that land. I think we have seen some efforts because of stories like that to take back that the earmark situation, and we have seen a significant decrease in earmarks, although now that we're not having earmarks, we're having something called letter marks and phone marks, which is where members of Congress who are prohibited from putting in earmarks in legislation call up the head of an agency and say, I need you to put in money for this, or make a request for this, and fund a specific project. So I think that members of Congress are always finding new ways to help the special interests at the loss of the rest of us.
Vivian on the phone from Tennessee, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. The first thing I haven't heard anybody say, well, yes, a few minutes ago they did, about the Supreme Court. They gave the right of way for people to disclose money for the Republicans and Democrats without telling us where it's going. We need to change the Supreme Court. They have a job for lifetime. Why should they have a job for lifetime? They're taking kickbacks up there, too. Clarence Thomas, for instance, with his wife, with the health care. We need to look at the Supreme Court, the rulers who are making these rules. Something needs to be done about the Supreme Court. They need a term limit. Thank you.
Well, interestingly, I think Governor Rick Perry, who is running for president, even suggested term limits for the Supreme Court. Again, that would also require a constitutional amendment, and I don't think there's a lot of effort to make that happen right now.
President Obama, in his election in 2008, raising over $700 million for his campaign. Obama hoodwinked McCain in the last election when it came to public financing. In 2012, the president's re-elect effort expected to raise collectively among his organization and the Democratic Party close to $1 billion.
I think it's not just President Obama who's going to be out there raising tons and tons of money. You're seeing all the candidates, all the Republican candidates also raising money. They also all have these super PACs. The president does, as does Mitt Romney and Governor Perry. They all do, which are ways to have more anonymous money running ads in their favor. So it is a significant problem. I agree that Mr. Obama didn't follow his promises in regard to how he'd follow campaign finances and take the public money for his last race. But this race, no one's going to be taking it. The presidential system is completely broken, and nobody who's running for president would take the money because it's too little money overall, and they can raise so much more money if they opt out of the system.
Citizensforethics.org is the website if you want to read the report from Crew. Jacqueline is on the phone, Brooklyn, New York. Good morning.
Yes, hello. Listen, I like to ask, how does the pensions of our congressmen and senators impact their stay in office? Is it something that they earn immediately upon winning election? And is it duration for a lifetime? And what is the impact of these pensions on our debt, the underlying debt of the country?
Thanks for the call. A good point, because it did change a couple of years ago depending on length of service, correct?
Right. Members of Congress's pensions are dependent on how long they're there. It increases for their length of service. And while it is a generous pension, I don't think it alone is really a significant contributing factor to our national debt.
Jack says this, a vote is free speech, yet restricted to registered voters. Donations to candidates can also be restricted, irrespective of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Well, I think that there's the jury's out on that, and I think there are other cases that are going through the courts that will help us understand the parameters of Citizens United and exactly what the Supreme Court will allow to be regulated and what will not. But I do think it is true that in order to really change Citizens United, the case will either have to be struck down or there will need to be a constitutional amendment, and I don't think we can expect to see either of those things happen in the near future.
Brian, Republican from Hamilton, Montana, with Melanie Sloan here in Washington. Good morning.
morning. Thank you for taking my call. Ms. Sloan, I'd like to ask a question. If term limits would put a complete stop to all this, that way they wouldn't be sitting in there forever and figure out how to work the scheme. Thank you.
Well, I know a lot of callers have really been advocating for term limits, but it would certainly depend on how long the term you were talking about. And I don't think, even if you were there for just a couple of terms, you'd need to be raising money for your reelection effort. So I think that there would still be that special interest money coming in. Further, I do think issues are more complicated than a lot of Americans give them credit for. Politicians do, when they work on these committees, gain a certain level of expertise. And just like we want our doctor to be experienced, we actually do want our politicians to have some experience. We want them to know what they're doing, and we want them to be able to work together and compromise for the good of all Americans.
Chris is joining us, Willis, Texas. Good morning.
Morning. I must like to say what we think we know about this country and what's going on in it is just a big facade. It's a matrix. News media is helping perpetrate that. We lost our control of our country when the Federal Reserve Bank was created, and when taxation was created. You know, American citizens are being forced to pay taxes on labor when the 16th Amendment was never ratified for that purpose. Americans need to educate themselves and wake up to what's really going on in this country. Thank you.
Chris, thanks for putting that on the table. Did you want to respond?
I think Americans do need to pay taxes. I'm sure that the caller appreciates having roads and electricity and telephone service and all of those kind of things we can thank in part our tax dollars for.
Jack, Prescott, Arizona, Democrats line, good morning.
Good morning. And, let's get down to the real thing. The Constitution says that my representative is supposed to represent me and the people that live in my district. My senators represent the state that I live in.
Jack, who's your representative in the House?
Pardon?
Who is your representative in the House?
Oh, Kozar. And the point is, if we go back to the Constitution, and I can vote in my school district, but I cannot vote in the city because I live in the county. And all money and voters should come from our district or our state, depending on the rep or the senator. And no union, no corporation, no outside PAC should be allowed to bring money from New York and put it into my district because they want to make a profit off of my district, and they don't even live here. And my representative's supposed to represent me and the people that live in the district. It sounds so simple, but we have this legalized bribery now, and the one person that called about the Supreme Court is correct, and we need to occupy the Supreme Court.
Jack, thanks for the call.
I do agree that basically our campaign finance system is legalized bribery. Members of Congress are trading legislative action for campaign contributions, and that under our current law is legal.
Ed has this point, you'd have to term limit staffers as well. Capitol Hill staffers do have a lot of influence.
Capitol Hill staffers do indeed have a significant amount of influence, and I think one thing that's been interesting about them is Jack Abramoff, a lobbyist who's been disgraced and went to jail over a very large scandal in 2006, was also in a recent 60 Minutes piece and talked about how staffers are so indebted to lobbyists because they're really looking at their staff, in their congressional staff position as just a stepping stone to their next job as a very highly paid lobbyist. So they are often very anxious to do lobbyist biddings because they are hoping to get jobs with those very same lobbyists.
Kirksville, Missouri is our next caller. Clyde is on the phone, Republican line. Good morning.
Morning.
Go ahead, Clyde.
We have a bunch of corrupt politicians in Washington, I think. They think more about getting reelected than anything else. And what we need to do is this last go-around on the deal, the national debt has increased in the last 10 or 12 years. Most of the debt's been accumulated in that length of time. And what we need to do is just vote those guys out. If they've been in there 12 years, vote them out.
Thanks for the call. There seems to be a common theme. David Walker also early in the program talking about term limits. But we've debated this issue in the past, and essentially it hasn't gone anywhere.
No, and let me say that one reason we shouldn't need term limits is we all have the ability to get rid of politicians we don't like. We get to vote them out of office. Members of Congress are up every 2 years, senators every 6. If we don't like how our politicians are acting, it is really up to us to get out to the voting booth and vote against them.
Our next call is Ted from Warrenton, Oregon, with Melanie Sloan. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, and I do appreciate Melanie's fight there at Capitol Hill every day. Good job.
Thank you.
On to my second point. I would probably think that every politician, from your local dog catcher to President Obama, should have a statement written by Thomas Jefferson so many years ago. He stated in the last days of his presidency that when I leave, my hands will be as clean and empty as the day I arrived. I believe that that statement should be in every politician's office in the country to keep them on track and to let them remember where we all came from and where they are hired to do a job.
Ted,
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly agree with you. It is not a job for people who want to get rich. If people want to get rich, they should go into high finance and go work for a hedge fund, not come and be a member of Congress.
And we'll go to Mike up early, Honolulu, Hawaii, with Melanie Sloan, Republican line. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Melanie. Thank you for your observations and for your hard work there in Hollywood, in Washington D.C. I ran for political office over here in Honolulu a couple times, and of course I'm out of it now. But I was discouraged because of the fact that our pension systems for these elected officials are proliferating their jobs, and we can go back to a lot of crooked politicians, Adam Clayton Powell, and of course the people that are coming up that are on TV lately, including Mrs. Pelosi and whatever else. I think all, including the president, all elected officers in our country should get into public service and no more pensions.
Mike, I'll stop you on that note. Thank you for the call. In Hawaii, your response.
There seems to be several people who agree with you that the pensions are the problem. I don't think that that's why the members of Congress get into the service for the pension benefits. I think they like the power, many of them, and they like the media position that they gain. So I think it is a very popular job, but I think that they do need to realize that they are serving a higher calling, which is Americans' interests, and I think that seems to have gotten lost for so many of our politicians.
And very quickly, how did you go about researching this?
Well, we combed through data by the Center for Responsive Politics and MapLight and created our own databases, combing through all of members' campaign contributions for the past 10 years, and then looked at their voting records.
It's all available online, citizensforethics.org, the Crew site. Melanie Sloan is the executive director. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.